Agatha Christie, The Double Clue. But above everything, no publicity, said Mr. Marcus Hardman for perhaps the 14th time. The word publicity occurred throughout his conversation with the regularity of a leitmotif. Mr. Hardman was a small man, delicately plump, with exquisitely manicured hands and a plaintive tenor voice. In his way, he was somewhat of a celebrity and the fashionable life was his profession. He was rich, but not remarkably so, and he spent his money zealously in the pursuit of social pleasure. His hobby was collecting. He had the collector's soul. Old lace, old fans, antique jewelry, nothing crude or modern for Marcus Hardman. Poirot and I, obeying an urgent summons, had arrived to find the little man writhing in an agony of indecision. Under the circumstances, to call in the police was abhorrent to him. On the other hand, not to call them in was to acquiesce in the loss of some of the gems of his collection. He hit upon Poirot as a compromise. My rubies, Monsieur Poirot, and the emerald necklace said to have belonged to Catherine de' Medici. Oh, the emerald necklace. If you will recount to me the circumstances of their disappearance, suggested Poirot gently. I am endeavoring to do so. Yesterday afternoon I had a little tea party, quite an informal affair, some half a dozen people or so. I have given one or two of them during the season, and though perhaps I should not say so, they have been quite a success. Some good music, Nicora, the pianist, and Catherine Bird, the Australian contralto, in the big studio. Well, early in the afternoon, I was showing my guests my collection of medieval jewels. I keep them in the small wall safe over there. It is arranged like a cabinet inside, with colored velvet background, to display the stones. Afterwards we inspected the fans, in the case on the wall. Then we all went to the studio for music. It was not until after everyone had gone that I discovered the safe rifled. I must have failed to shut it properly, and someone had seized the opportunity to denude it of its contents. The rubies, Monsieur Poirot, the emerald necklace, the collection of a lifetime. What would I not give to recover them? But there must be no publicity. You fully understand that, do you not, Monsieur Poirot? My own guests, my personal friends. It would be a horrible scandal. Who was the last person to leave this room when you went to the studio? Mr. Johnston. You may know him. The South African millionaire. He has just rented the Abbotberry's house in Park Lane. He lingered behind a few moments, I remember. But surely, oh, surely it could not be he. Did any of your guests return to this room during the afternoon on any pretext? I was prepared for that question, Monsieur Poirot. 3 of them did so. Countess Vera Rosikoff, Mr. Bernard Parker, and Lady Runcorn. Let us hear about them. The Countess Rosikoff is a very charming Russian lady, a member of the old regime. She has recently come to this country. She had bade me goodbye, and I was therefore somewhat surprised to find her in this room apparently gazing in rapture at my cabinet of fans. You know, Monsieur Poirot, the more I think of it, the more suspicious it seems to me. Don't you agree? Extremely suspicious, but let us hear about the others. Well, Parker simply came here to fetch a case of miniatures that I was anxious to show to Lady Runcorn. And Lady Runcorn herself? As I dare say you know, Lady Runcorn is a middle-aged woman of considerable force of character who devotes most of her time to various charitable committees. She simply returned to fetch a handbag she had laid down somewhere. Bien, monsieur. So we have 4 possible suspects. The Russian Countess, the English Grande Dame, the South African millionaire, and Mr. Bernard Parker. Who is Mr. Parker, by the way? The question appeared to embarrass Mr. Hardman considerably. He is a young fellow. Well, in fact, a young fellow I know. I had already deduced as much, replied Poirot gravely. What does he do, this Mr. Parker? He is a young man about town, not, perhaps, quite in the swim, if I may so express myself. How did he come to be a friend of yours, may I ask? Well, on 1 or 2 occasions he has performed certain little commissions for me. Continue, monsieur, said Poirot. Hardman looked piteously at him. Evidently the last thing he wanted to do was to continue. But as Poirot maintained an inexorable silence, he capitulated. You see, Monsieur Poirot, it is well known that I am interested in antique jewels. Sometimes there is a family heirloom to be disposed of, which, mind you, would never be sold in the open market or to a dealer. But a private sale to me is a very different matter. Parker arranges the details of such things, he is in touch with both sides, and thus any little embarrassment is avoided. He brings anything of that kind to my notice. For instance, the Countess Rosikoff has brought some family jewels with her from Russia. She is anxious to sell them. Bernard Parker was to have arranged the transaction. I see, said Poirot thoughtfully. And you trust him implicitly? I have had no reason to do otherwise. Mr. Hardman, of these 4 people, which do you yourself suspect? Oh, Monsieur Poirot, what a question. They are my friends, as I told you. I suspect none of them, or all of them, whichever way you like to put it. I do not agree. You suspect one of those 4. It is not Countess Rosikoff. It is not Mr. Parker. Is it Lady Runcorn or Mr. Johnston? You drive me into a corner, Monsieur Poirot, you do indeed. I am most anxious to have no scandal. Lady Runcorn belongs to one of the oldest families in England. But it is true, it is most unfortunately true, that her aunt, Lady Caroline, suffered from a most melancholy affliction. It was understood, of course, by all her friends, and her maid returned the teaspoons, or whatever it was, as promptly as possible. You see my predicament. So Lady Runcorn had an aunt who was a kleptomaniac. Very interesting. You permit that I examine the safe? Mr. Hardman assenting, Poirot pushed back the door of the safe and examined the interior. The empty velvet-lined shelves gaped at us. Even now the door does not shut properly, murmured Poirot, as he swung it to and fro. I wonder why. Ah, what have we here? A glove, caught in the hinge. A man's glove. He held it out to Mr. Hardman. That's not one of my gloves, the latter declared. Aha! Something more. Poirot bent deftly and picked up a small object from the floor of the safe. It was a flat cigarette case made of black moire. My cigarette case, cried Mr. Hardman. Yours? Surely not, monsieur. Those are not your initials. He pointed to an entwined monogram of 2 letters executed in platinum. Hardman took it in his hand. You are right, he declared. It is very like mine, but the initials are different. A B and a P. Good heavens, Parker. It would seem so, said Poirot. A somewhat careless young man, especially if the glove is his also. That would be a double clue, would it not? Bernard Parker, murmured Hardman. What a relief. Well, Monsieur Poirot, I leave it to you to recover the jewels. Place the matter in the hands of the police if you think fit, that is, if you are quite sure that it is he who is guilty. See you, my friend, said Poirot to me, as we left the house together, he has one law for the titled, and another law for the plain, this Mr. Hardman. Me, I have not yet been ennobled, so I am on the side of the plain. I have sympathy for this young man. The whole thing was a little curious, was it not? There was Hardman suspecting Lady Runcorn, there was I, suspecting the Countess and Johnston, and all the time, the obscure Mr. Parker was our man. Why did you suspect the other 2? Parbleu! It is such a simple thing to be a Russian refugee or a South African millionaire. Any woman can call herself a Russian countess, anyone can buy a house in Park Lane and call himself a South African millionaire. Who is going to contradict them? But I observe that we are passing through Berry Street. Our careless young friend lives here. Let us, as you say, strike while the iron is in the fire. Mr. Bernard Parker was at home. We found him reclining on some cushions, clad in an amazing dressing gown of purple and orange. I have seldom taken a greater dislike to anyone than I did to this particular young man with his white, effeminate face and affected lisping speech. Good morning, monsieur, said Poirot briskly. I come from Mr. Hardman. Yesterday, at the party, somebody has stolen all his jewels. Permit me to ask you, monsieur, is this your glove? Mr. Parker's mental processes did not seem very rapid. He stared at the glove, as though gathering his wits together. Where did you find it? He asked at last. Is it your glove, monsieur? Mr. Parker appeared to make up his mind. No, it isn't, he declared. And this cigarette case, is that yours? Certainly not. I always carry a silver one. Very well, monsieur. I go to put matters in the hands of the police. Oh, I say, I wouldn't do that if I were you, cried Mr. Parker in some concern. Beastly unsympathetic people, the police. Wait a bit. I'll go round and see old Hardman. Look here, oh, stop a minute. But Poirot beat a determined retreat. We have given him something to think about, have we not? He chuckled. Tomorrow we will observe what has occurred. But we were destined to have a reminder of the Hardman case that afternoon. Without the least warning the door flew open, and a whirlwind in human form invaded our privacy, bringing with her a swirl of sables. It was as cold as only an English June day can be, and a hat rampant with slaughtered ospreys. Countess Vera Rosikoff was a somewhat disturbing personality. You are Monsieur Poirot. What is this that you have done? You accuse that poor boy. It is infamous. It is scandalous. I know him. He is a chicken, a lamb, never would he steal. He has done everything for me. Will I stand by and see him martyred and butchered? Tell me, madam, is this his cigarette case? Poirot held out the Blackmore case. The Countess paused for a moment while she inspected it. Yes, it is his. I know it well. What of it? Did you find it in the room? We were all there. He dropped it then, I suppose. Ah, you policemen, you are worse than the Red Guards, and is this his glove? How should I know? One glove is like another. Do not try to stop me, he must be set free. His character must be cleared. You shall do it. I will sell my jewels and give you much money. Madam, it is agreed, then. No, no, do not argue. The poor boy. He came to me, the tears in his eyes. I will save you, I said. I will go to this man, this ogre, this monster. Leave it to Vera. Now it is settled, I go. With as little ceremony as she had come, she swept from the room, leaving an overpowering perfume of an exotic nature behind her. What a woman! I exclaimed. And what furs! Ah, yes, they were genuine enough. Could a spurious countess have real furs? My little joke, Hastings, no, she is truly Russian, I fancy. Well, well, so Master Bernard went bleeding to her. The cigarette case is his. I wonder if the glove is also. With a smile Poirot drew from his pocket a second glove and placed it by the first. There was no doubt of there being a pair. Where did you get the second one, Poirot? It was thrown down with a stick on the table in the hall in Berry Street. Truly, a very careless young man, Monsieur Parker. Well, well, mon ami, we must be thorough. Just for the form of the thing, I will make a little visit to Park Lane. Needless to say, I accompanied my friend. Johnston was out, but we saw his private secretary. It transpired that Johnston had only recently arrived from South Africa. He had never been in England before. He is interested in precious stones, is he not? Hazarded Poirot. Gold mining is nearer the mark, laughed the secretary. Poirot came away from the interview thoughtful. Late that evening, to my utter surprise, I found him earnestly studying a Russian grammar. Good heavens, Poirot! I cried. Are you learning Russian in order to converse with the Countess in her own language? She certainly would not listen to my English, my friend. But surely, Poirot, well-born Russians invariably speak French. You are a mine of information, Hastings. I will cease puzzling over the intricacies of the Russian alphabet. He threw the book from him with a dramatic gesture. I was not entirely satisfied. There was a twinkle in his eye which I knew of old. It was an invariable sign that Hercule Poirot was pleased with himself. Perhaps, I said sapiently, you doubt her being really a Russian. You are going to test her. Ah, no, no, she is Russian all right. Well, then, if you really want to distinguish yourself over this case, Hastings, I recommend First Steps in Russian as an invaluable aid. Then he laughed and would say no more. I picked up the book from the floor and dipped into it curiously, but could make neither head nor tail of Poirot's remarks. The following morning brought us no news of any kind, but that did not seem to worry my little friend. At breakfast, he announced his intention of calling upon Mr. Hardman early in the day. We found the elderly social butterfly at home, and seemingly a little calmer than on the previous day. Well, Monsieur Poirot, any news?" he demanded eagerly. Poirot handed him a slip of paper. "That is the person who took the jewels, monsieur. Shall I put matters in the hands of the police? Or would you prefer me to recover the jewels without bringing the police into the matter?" Mr. Hardman was staring at the paper. At last he found his voice. "Most astonishing. I should infinitely prefer to have no scandal in the matter. I give you carte blanche, Monsieur Poirot. I am sure you will be discreet." Our next procedure was to hail a taxi, which Poirot ordered to drive to the Carlton. There he inquired for Countess Rosikoff. In a few minutes we were ushered up into the ladies' suite. She came to meet us with outstretched hands, arrayed in a marvelous negligée of barbaric design. "Monsieur Poirot," she cried. "You have succeeded. You have cleared that poor infant. Madame la Comtesse, your friend Mr. Parker is perfectly safe from arrest." "Ah, but you are the clever little man. Superb. And so quickly too. On the other hand, I have promised Mr. Hardman that the jewels shall be returned to him today. So. Therefore, madam, I should be extremely obliged if you would place them in my hands without delay. I am sorry to hurry you, but I am keeping a taxi, in case it should be necessary for me to go on to Scotland Yard, and we Belgians, madam, we practice the thrift." The Countess had lighted a cigarette. For some seconds she sat perfectly still, blowing smoke rings, and gazing steadily at Poirot. Then she burst into a laugh, and rose. She went across to the bureau, opened a drawer, and took out a black silk handbag. She tossed it lightly to Poirot. Her tone, when she spoke, was perfectly light and unmoved. "We Russians, on the contrary, practice prodigality," she said. "And to do that, unfortunately, one must have money. You need not look inside. They are all there." Poirot arose. "I congratulate you, madam, on your quick intelligence and your promptitude." "Ah! But since you were keeping your taxi waiting, what else could I do?" "You are too amiable, madam. You are remaining long in London?" "I am afraid no, owing to you." "Accept my apologies. We shall meet again elsewhere, perhaps." "I hope so." "And I do not," exclaimed the Countess with a laugh. "It is a great compliment that I pay you there are very few men in the world whom I fear. Goodbye, Monsieur Poirot." "Goodbye, Madame la Comtesse." "Ah, pardon me, I forgot. Allow me to return you your cigarette case." And with a bow he handed to her the little Blackmore case we had found in the safe. She accepted it without any change of expression, just a lifted eyebrow and a murmured, "I see." "What a woman," cried Poirot enthusiastically as we descended the stairs. "Mon Dieu, quelle femme!" Not a word of argument, of protestation, of bluff. One quick glance, and she had sized up the position correctly. "I tell you, Hastings, a woman who can accept defeat like that, with a careless smile, will go far. She is dangerous, she has the nerves of steel, he tripped heavily. If you can manage to moderate your transports and look where you're going, it might be as well," I suggested. "When did you first suspect the Countess?" "Mon ami, it was the glove and the cigarette case, the double clue, shall we say, that worried me. Bernard Parker might easily have dropped one or the other, but hardly both." "Ah, no, that would have been too careless. In the same way, if someone else had placed them there to incriminate Parker, one would have been sufficient, the cigarette case or the glove, again not both. So I was forced to the conclusion that one of the two things did not belong to Parker. I imagined at first that the case was his, and that the glove was not. But when I discovered the fellow to the glove, I saw that it was the other way about. Whose, then, was the cigarette case? Clearly, it could not belong to Lady Runcorn. The initials were wrong. Mr. Johnston. Only if he were here under a false name. I interviewed his secretary, and it was apparent at once that everything was clear and above board. There was no reticence about Mr. Johnston's past. The Countess, then. She was supposed to have brought jewels with her from Russia, she had only to take the stones from their settings, and it was extremely doubtful if they could ever be identified. What could be easier for her than to pick up one of Parker's gloves from the hall that day and thrust it into the safe? But, bien sûr, she did not intend to drop her own cigarette case. But if the case was hers, why did it have BP on it? The Countess's initials are VR. Poirot smiled gently upon me. Exactly, mon ami, but in the Russian alphabet, B is V and P is R. Well, you couldn't expect me to guess that. I don't know Russian. Neither do I, Hastings. That is why I bought my little book, and urged it on your attention. He sighed. A remarkable woman. I have a feeling, my friend, a very decided feeling, I shall meet her again. Where, I wonder? Agatha Christie, the clergyman's daughter. I wish, said Tuppence, roaming moodily round the office, that we could befriend a clergyman's daughter. Why? Asked Tommy. You may have forgotten the fact, but I was once a clergyman's daughter myself. I remember what it was like. Hence this altruistic urge, this spirit of thoughtful consideration for others, this dash. You are getting ready to be Roger Sheringham, I see, said Tommy. If you will allow me to make a criticism, you talk quite as much as he does, but not nearly so well. On the contrary, said Tuppence, there is a feminine subtlety about my conversation, a je ne sais quoi, that no gross male could ever attain to. I have, moreover, powers unknown to my prototype. Do I mean prototype? Words are such uncertain things, they so often sound well but mean the opposite of what one thinks they do. Go on, said Tommy kindly. I was only pausing to take breath. Touching these powers, it is my wish today to assist a clergyman's daughter. You will see, Tommy, the first person to enlist the aid of Blunt's brilliant detectives will be a clergyman's daughter. I'll bet you it isn't, said Tommy. Done, said Tuppence. Hist. To your typewriters, oh. Israel. One comes. Mr. Blunt's office was humming with industry as Albert opened the door and announced, Miss Monica Dean. A slender brown-haired girl, rather shabbily dressed, entered and stood hesitating. Tommy came forward. Good morning, Miss Dean. Won't you sit down and tell us what we can do for you? By the way, let me introduce my confidential secretary, Miss Sheringham. I am delighted to make your acquaintance, Miss Dean, said Tuppence. Your father was in the church, I think. Yes, he was. But how did you know that? Oh. We have our methods, said Tuppence. You mustn't mind me rattling on. Mr. Blunt likes to hear me talk. He always says it gives him ideas. The girl stared at her. She was a slender creature, not beautiful, but possessing a wistful prettiness. She had a quantity of soft mouse-colored hair, and her eyes were dark blue and very lovely, though the dark shadows round them spoke of trouble and anxiety. "Will you tell me your story, Miss Dean?" said Tommy. The girl turned to him gratefully. "It's such a long, rambling story," said the girl. "My name is Monica Dean. My father was the rector of Little Hampsley in Suffolk. He died 3 years ago, and my mother and I were left very badly off. I went out as a governess, but my mother became a confirmed invalid and I had to come home to look after her. We were desperately poor, but one day we received a lawyer's letter telling us that an aunt of my father's had died and had left everything to me. I had often heard of this aunt who had quarreled with my father many years ago, and I knew that she was very well off, so it really seemed that our troubles were at an end. But matters did not turn out quite as well as we had hoped. I inherited the house she had lived in, but after paying 1 or 2 small legacies, there was no money left. I suppose she must have lost it during the war, or perhaps she had been living on her capital. Still, we had the house, and almost at once we had a chance of selling it at quite an advantageous price. But, foolishly perhaps, I refused the offer. We were in tiny, but expensive lodgings, and I thought it would be much nicer to live in the red house where my mother could have comfortable rooms and take in paying guests to cover our expenses. I adhered to this plan, notwithstanding a further tempting offer from the gentleman who wanted to buy. We moved in, and I advertised for paying guests. For a time, all went well. We had several answers to our advertisement. My aunt's old servant remained on with us and she and I between us did the work of the house. And then these unaccountable things began to happen. What things? The queerest things. The whole place seemed bewitched. Pictures fell down, crockery flew across the room and broke. One morning we came down to find all the furniture moved round. At first we thought someone was playing a practical joke, but we had to give up that explanation. Sometimes when we were all sitting down to dinner, a terrific crash would be heard overhead. We would go up and find no one there, but a piece of furniture thrown violently to the ground. "A poltergeist," cried Tuppence, much interested. "Yes, that's what Dr. O'Neill said, though I don't know what it means." "It's a sort of evil spirit that plays tricks," explained Tuppence, who in reality knew very little of the subject, and was not even sure that she had got the word poltergeist right. Well, at any rate, the effect was disastrous. Our visitors were frightened to death, and left as soon as possible. We got new ones, and they too left hurriedly. I was in despair, and, to crown all, our own tiny income ceased suddenly. The company in which it was invested failed. "You poor dear," said Tuppence sympathetically. "What a time you have had. Did you want Mr. Blunt to investigate this haunting business?" "Not exactly. You see, 3 days ago, a gentleman called upon us. His name was Dr. O'Neill. He told us that he was a member of the Society for Physical Research, and that he had heard about the curious manifestations that had taken place in our house and was much interested. So much so, that he was prepared to buy it from us, and conduct a series of experiments there. Well, of course, at first, I was overcome with joy. It seemed the way out of all our difficulties. But yes. Perhaps you will think me fanciful. Perhaps I am. But oh, I'm sure I haven't made a mistake. It was the same man." "What same man?" "The same man who wanted to buy it before." "Oh. I'm sure I'm right. But why shouldn't it be? You don't understand." The 2 men were quite different name and everything. The first man was quite young, a spruce dark young man of 30-odd. Dr. O'Neill is about 50, he has a grey beard and wears glasses and stoops. But when he talked I saw a gold tooth on one side of his mouth. It only shows when he laughs. The other man had a tooth in just the same position, and then I looked at his ears. I had noticed the other man's ears, because they were a peculiar shape with hardly any lobe. Dr. O'Neill's were just the same. Both things couldn't be a coincidence, could they? I thought and finally I wrote and said I would let him know in a week. I had noticed Mr. Blunt's advertisement some time ago as a matter of fact in an old paper that lined one of the kitchen drawers. I cut it out and came up to town. "You were quite right," said Tuppence, nodding her head with vigor. "This needs looking into." "A very interesting case, Miss Dean," observed Tommy. "We shall be pleased to look into this for you, Miss Sheringham." "Rather," said Tuppence, "and we'll get to the bottom of it too." "I understand, Miss Dean," went on Tommy, that the household consists of you and your mother and a servant. Can you give me any particulars about the servant? Her name is Crockett. She was with my aunt about 8 or 10 years. She is an elderly woman, not very pleasant in manner, but a good servant. She is inclined to give herself airs because her sister married out of her station. Crockett has a nephew whom she is always telling us is quite the gentleman. Said Tommy, rather at a loss how to proceed. Tuppence had been eyeing Monica keenly, now she spoke with sudden decision. I think the best plan would be for Miss Dean to come out and lunch with me. It's just on 1 o'clock. I can get full details from her. Certainly, Miss Sheringham, said Tommy. An excellent plan. Look here, said Tuppence when they were comfortably ensconced at a little table in a neighboring restaurant, I want to know. Is there any special reason why you want to find out about all this? Monica blushed. Well, you see out with it, said Tuppence encouragingly. Well, there are 2 men who want to marry me. The usual story, I suppose. One rich, one poor, and the poor one is the one you like. I don't know how you know all these things, murmured the girl. That's a sort of law of nature, explained Tuppence. It happens to everybody. It happens to me. You see, even if I sell the house, it won't bring us enough to live on. Gerald is a dear, but he's desperately poor, though he's a very clever engineer, and if only he had a little capital, his firm would take him into partnership. The other, Mr. Partridge, is a very good man, I am sure, and well off, and if I married him it would be an end of all our troubles. But I know, said Tuppence sympathetically. It isn't the same thing at all. You can go on telling yourself how good and worthy he is, and adding up his qualities as though they were in addition some, and it all has a simply refrigerating effect. Monica nodded. Well, said Tuppence, I think it would be as well if we went down to the neighborhood and studied matters upon the spot. What is the address? The Red House, Stourton in the Marsh. Tuppence wrote down the address in her notebook. I didn't ask you, Monica began about terms she ended, blushing a little. Our payments are strictly by results, said Tuppence gravely. If the secret of the Red House is a profitable one, as seems possible from the anxiety displayed to acquire the property, we should expect a small percentage, otherwise nothing. Thank you very much, said the girl gratefully. And now, said Tuppence, don't worry. Everything's going to be all right. Let's enjoy lunch and talk of interesting things. Well, said Tommy, looking out of the window of the Crown and Anchor, here we are at Toad in the Hole, or whatever this blasted village is called. Let us review the case, said Tuppence. By all means, said Tommy. To begin with, getting my say in first, I suspect the invalid mother. Why? My dear Tuppence, grant that this poltergeist business is all a put-up job, got up in order to persuade the girl to sell the house, someone must have thrown the things about. Now the girl said everyone was at dinner, but if the mother is a thoroughgoing invalid, she'd be upstairs in her room. If she was an invalid she could hardly throw furniture about. Ah! But she wouldn't be a real invalid. She'd be shamming. Why? There you have me, confessed her husband. I was really going on the well-known principle of suspecting the most unlikely person. You always make fun of everything, said Tuppence severely. There must be something that makes these people so anxious to get hold of the house. And if you don't care about getting to the bottom of this matter, I do. I like that girl. She's a dear. Tommy nodded seriously enough. I quite agree. But I never can resist ragging you, Tuppence. Of course there's something queer about the house, and whatever it is, it's something that's difficult to get at. Otherwise a mere burglary would do the trick. But to be willing to buy the house means either that you've got to take up floors or pull down walls, or else that there's a coal mine under the back garden. I don't want it to be a coal mine. Buried treasure is much more romantic. Said Tommy. In that case I think that I shall pay a visit to the local bank manager, explain that I am staying here over Christmas and probably buying the Red House, and discuss the question of opening an account. But why ? Wait and see. Tommy returned at the end of half an hour. His eyes were twinkling. We advance, Tuppence. Our interview proceeded on the lines indicated. I then asked casually whether he had had much gold paid in, as is often the case nowadays in these small country banks, small farmers who hoarded it during the war, you understand. From that we proceeded quite naturally to the extraordinary vagaries of old ladies. I invented an aunt, who on the outbreak of the war, drove to the army in Navy stores in a four-wheeler, and returned with 16 hams. He immediately mentioned a client of his own who had insisted on drawing out every penny of money she had in gold as far as possible, and who also insisted on having her securities, bearer bonds and such things, given into her own custody. I exclaimed on such an act of folly, and he mentioned casually that she was the former owner of the Red House. You see, tuppence. She drew out all this money, and she hid it somewhere. You remember that Monica Dean mentioned that they were astonished at the small amount of her estate. Yes, she hid it in the Red House, and someone knows about it. I can make a pretty good guess who that someone is too. Who? What about the faithful Crockett? She would know all about her mistress's peculiarities. And that gold-toothed Dr. O'Neill? The gentlemanly nephew, of course. That's it. But whereabouts did she hide it? You know more about old ladies than I do, tuppence. Where do they hide things? Wrapped up in stockings and petticoats, under mattresses. Tommy nodded. I expect you're right. All the same, she can't have done that because it would have been found when her things were turned over. It worries me, an old lady like that can't have taken up floors or dug holes in the garden. All the same, it's there in the Red House somewhere. Crockett hasn't found it, but she knows it's there, and once they get the house to themselves, she and her precious nephew, they can turn it upside down until they find what they're after. We've got to get ahead of them. Come on, tuppence. We'll go to the Red House. Monica Dean received them. To her mother and Crockett they were represented as would-be purchasers of the Red House, which would account for their being taken all over the house and grounds. Tommy did not tell Monica of the conclusions he had come to, but he asked her various searching questions. Of the garments and personal belongings of the dead woman, some had been given to Crockett and the others sent to various poor families. Everything had been gone through and turned out. Did your aunt leave any papers? The desk was full, and there were some in a drawer in her bedroom, but there was nothing of importance amongst them. Have they been thrown away? No, my mother is always very loath to throw away old papers. There were some old-fashioned recipes among them which she intends to go through one day. Good, said Tommy approvingly. Then, indicating an old man who was at work upon one of the flower beds in the garden, he asked, was that old man the gardener here in your aunt's time? Yes, he used to come 3 days a week. He lives in the village. Poor old fellow, he is past doing any really useful work. We have him just once a week to keep things tidied up. We can't afford more. Tommy winked at tuppence to indicate that she was to keep Monica with her, and he himself stepped across to where the gardener was working. He spoke a few pleasant words to the old man, asked him if he had been there in the old lady's time, and then said casually, You buried a box for her once, didn't you? No, sir, I never buried naught for her. What should she want to bury a box for? Tommy shook his head. He strolled back to the house frowning. It was to be hoped that a study of the old lady's papers would yield some clue, otherwise the problem was a hard one to solve. The house itself was old-fashioned, but not old enough to contain a secret room or passage. Before leaving, Monica brought them down a big cardboard box, tied with string. I've collected all the papers, she whispered. And they're in here. I thought you could take it away with you, and then you'll have plenty of time to go over them, but I'm sure you won't find anything to throw light on the mysterious happenings in this house. Her words were interrupted by a terrific crash overhead. Tommy ran quickly up the stairs. A jug and basin in one of the front rooms was lying on the ground, broken to pieces. There was no one in the room. The ghost up to its tricks again, he murmured with a grin. He went downstairs again thoughtfully. I wonder, Miss Dean, if I might speak to the maid, Crockett, for a minute. Certainly. I will ask her to come to you. Monica went off to the kitchen. She returned with the elderly maid who had opened the door to them earlier. We are thinking of buying this house, said Tommy pleasantly, and my wife was wondering whether, in that case, you would care to remain on with us. Crockett's respectable face displayed no emotion of any kind. Thank you, sir, she said. I should like to think it over if I may. Tommy turned to Monica. I am delighted with the house, Miss Dean. I understand that there is another buyer in the market. I know what he has offered for the house, and I will willingly give 100 more. And mind you, that is a good price I am offering." Monica murmured something non-committal, and the Beresfords took their leave. "I was right," said Tommy, as they went down the drive. "Crockett's in it. Did you notice that she was out of breath? That was from running down the back stairs after smashing the jug and basin. Sometimes, very likely, she has admitted her nephew secretly, and he has done a little poltergeisting, or whatever you call it, whilst she has been innocently with the family. You'll see, Dr. O'Neill will make a further offer before the day is out." True enough, after dinner a note was brought. It was from Monica. "I have just heard from Dr. O'Neill. He raises his previous offer by £150. The nephew must be a man of means," said Tommy thoughtfully. "And I tell you what, tuppence, the prize he's after must be well worthwhile. Oh. 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 If only we could find it. Well, let's get on with the spade work." They were sorting through the big box of papers, a wearisome affair, as they were all jumbled up pell-mell without any kind of order or method. Every few minutes they compared notes. "What's the latest, tuppence?" 2 old receipted bills, 3 unimportant letters, a recipe for preserving new potatoes and 1 for making lemon cheesecake. "What's yours?" 1 bill, poem on spring, 2 newspaper cuttings, Why Women by Pearls, a sound investment, and Man with 4 Wives extraordinary story, and a recipe for jugged hare. "It's heartbreaking," said tuppence, and they fell to once more. At last the box was empty. They looked at each other. "I put this aside," said Tommy, picking up a half sheet of notepaper, "because it struck me as peculiar. But I don't suppose it's got anything to do with what we're looking for." "Let's see it." "Oh. It's one of those funny things, what do they call them? Anagrams, charades or something." She read it. "My first you put on glowing coal and into it you put my whole, my second really is the first, my third mislikes the winter blast." Said Tommy critically. "I don't think much of the poet's rhymes." "I don't see what you find peculiar about it, though," said tuppence. "Everybody used to have a collection of these sort of things about 50 years ago. You saved them up for winter evenings round the fire." "I wasn't referring to the verse. It's the words written below it that strike me as peculiar." St. Luke 11:9, she read. "It's a text." "Yes. Doesn't that strike you as odd? Would an old lady of a religious persuasion write a text just under a charade?" "It is rather odd," agreed tuppence thoughtfully. "I presume that you, being a clergyman's daughter, have got your Bible with you." "As a matter of fact I have." "Aha, you didn't expect that. Wait a sec. Tuppence ran to her suitcase, extracted a small red volume and returned to the table. She turned the leaves rapidly. Here we are. Luke, chapter 11, verse 9. Oh. Tommy, look. Tommy bent over and looked where Tuppence's small finger pointed to a portion of the verse in question. Seek, and ye shall find. That's it, cried Tuppence. We've got it. Solve the cryptogram and the treasure is ours, or rather Monica's. Well, let's get to work on the cryptogram, as you call it. My first you put on glowing coal. What does that mean, I wonder? Then my second really is the first. That's pure gibberish. It's quite simple really, said Tuppence kindly. It's just a sort of knack. Let me have it. Tommy surrendered it willingly. Tuppence ensconced herself in an armchair, and began muttering to herself with bent brows. It's quite simple really, murmured Tommy when half an hour had elapsed. Don't crow. We're the wrong generation for this. I've a good mind to go back to town tomorrow and call on some old pussy who would probably read it as easy as winking. It's a knack, that's all. Well, let's have one more try. There aren't many things you can put on glowing coal, said Tuppence thoughtfully. There's water, to put it out, or wood, or a kettle. It must be one syllable, I suppose. What about wood, then? You couldn't put anything into wood, though. There's no one-syllable word instead of water, but there must be one-syllable things you can put on a fire in the kettle line. Saucepans, mused Tuppence. Frying pans. How about pan? Or pot? What's a word beginning pan or pot that is something you cook? Pottery, suggested Tommy. You bake that in the fire. Wouldn't that be near enough? The rest of it doesn't fit. Pancakes? No. Oh. Bother. They were interrupted by the little serving maid, who told them that dinner would be ready in a few minutes. Only Mrs. Lumley, she wanted to know if you'd like your potatoes fried, or boiled in their jackets. She's got some of each. Boiled in their jackets, said Tuppence promptly. I love potatoes dash. She stopped dead with her mouth open. What's the matter, Tuppence? Have you seen a ghost? Tommy, cried Tuppence. Don't you see? That's it. The word, I mean. Potatoes. My first you put on glowing coal, that's pot. And into it you put my whole. My second really is the first, that's A, the first letter of the alphabet. My third mislikes the wintry blast cold toes, of course. You're right, Tuppence. Very clever of you. But I'm afraid we've wasted an awful lot of time over nothing. Potatoes don't fit in at all with missing treasure. Half a sec, though. What did you read out just now, when we were going through the box? Something about a recipe for new potatoes. I wonder whether there's anything in that. He rummaged hastily through the pile of recipes. Here it is. To keep new potatoes. Put the new potatoes into tins and bury them in the garden. Even in the middle of winter, they will taste as though freshly dug. We've got it, screamed Tuppence. That's it. The treasure is in the garden, buried in a tin. But I asked the gardener. He said he'd never buried anything. Yes, I know, but that's because people never really answer what you say, they answer what they think you mean. He knew he'd never buried anything out of the common. We'll go tomorrow and ask him where he buried the potatoes. The following morning was Christmas Eve. By dint of inquiry they found the old gardener's cottage. Tuppence broached the subject after some minutes' conversation. I wish one could have new potatoes at Christmas time, she remarked. Wouldn't they be good with turkey? Do people round here ever bury them in tins? I've heard that keeps them fresh. Aye, that they do, declared the old man. Old Miss Dean, up to the red house, she always had 3 tins buried every summer, and as often as not forgot to have them dug up again. In the bed by the house, as a rule, didn't she? No, over against the wall by the fir tree. Having got the information they wanted, they soon took their leave of the old man, presenting him with 5 shillings as a Christmas box. And now for Monica, said Tommy. Tommy. You have no sense of the dramatic. Leave it to me. I've got a beautiful plan. Do you think you could manage to beg, borrow, or steal a spade? Somehow or other, a spade was duly produced, and that night, late, 2 figures might have been seen stealing into the grounds of the Red House. The place indicated by the gardener was easily found, and Tommy set to work. Presently his spade rang on metal, and a few seconds later he had unearthed a big biscuit tin. It was sealed round with adhesive plaster and firmly fastened down, but Tuppence, by the aid of Tommy's knife, soon managed to open it. Then she gave a groan. The tin was full of potatoes. She poured them out so that the tin was completely empty, but there were no other contents. "Go on digging, Tommy." It was some time before a second tin rewarded their search as before Tuppence unsealed it. "Well?" demanded Tommy anxiously. "Potatoes again." "Damn," said Tommy and set to once more. "The third time is lucky," said Tuppence consolingly. "I believe the whole thing's a mare's nest," said Tommy gloomily, but he continued to dig. At last a third tin was brought to light. "Potatoes aga dash," began Tuppence, then stopped. "Oh. Tommy, we've got it. It's only potatoes on top. Look." She held up a big old-fashioned velvet bag. "Cut along home," cried Tommy. "It's icy cold. Take the bag with you. I must just shovel back the earth. And may 1,000 curses light upon your head, Tuppence, if you open that bag before I come. I'll play fair. Ouch. I'm frozen." She beat a speedy retreat. On arrival at the inn she had not long to wait. Tommy was hard upon her heels, perspiring freely after his digging in the final brisk run. "Now then," said Tommy. "The private inquiry agents make good. Open the loot, Mrs. Beresford." Inside the bag was a package done up in oil silk and a heavy chamois leather bag. They opened the latter first. It was full of gold sovereigns. Tommy counted them. 200 pounds. That was all they would let her have, I suppose. "Cut open the package." Tuppence did so. It was full of closely folded banknotes. Tommy and Tuppence counted them carefully. They amounted to exactly 20,000 pounds. "Phew," said Tommy. "Isn't it lucky for Monica that we're both rich and honest? What's that done up in tissue paper?" Tuppence unrolled the little parcel and drew out a magnificent string of pearls, exquisitely matched. "I don't know much about these things," said Tommy slowly, "but I'm pretty sure that those pearls are worth another 5,000 pounds at least. Look at the size of them. Now I see why the old lady kept that cutting about pearls being a good investment. She must have realized all her securities and turned them into notes and jewels. Oh. Tommy, isn't it wonderful? Darling Monica. Now she can marry her nice young man and live happily ever afterwards, like me. That's rather sweet of you, Tuppence. So you are happy with me?" "As a matter of fact," said Tuppence, "I am. But I didn't mean to say so. It slipped out. What with being excited, and Christmas Eve, and one thing and another dash, if you really love me," said Tommy, "will you answer me one question?" "I hate these catches," said Tuppence. "But well, all right. Then how did you know that Monica was a clergyman's daughter?" "Oh, that was just cheating," said Tuppence happily. "I opened her letter making an appointment, and a Mr. Dean was father's curate once and he had a little girl called Monica, about 4 or 5 years younger than me. So I put 2 and 2 together." "You are a shameless creature," said Tommy. "Hello, there's 12 o'clock striking. Happy Christmas, Tuppence." "Happy Christmas, Tommy. It'll be a happy Christmas for Monica too, and all owing to us. I am glad. Poor thing, she has been so miserable. Do you know, Tommy, I feel all queer and choky about the throat when I think of it." "Darling Tuppence," said Tommy. "Darling Tommy," said Tuppence. "How awfully sentimental we are getting." "Christmas comes but once a year," said Tommy sententiously. "That's what our great-grandmother said, and I expect there's a lot of truth in it still." "Agatha Christie, The Shadow on the Glass." "Listen to this," said Lady Cynthia Drage. She read aloud from the journal she held in her hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Uncurtain are entertaining a party at Greenway's house this week. Amongst the guests are Lady Cynthia Drage, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Scott, Major Porter, D.S.O., Mrs. Staverton, Captain Allinson and Mr. Satterthwaite." "It's as well," remarked Lady Cynthia, casting away the paper, "to know what we're in for. But they have made a mess of things. Her companion, that same Mr. Satterthwaite, whose name figured at the end of the list of guests, looked at her interrogatively. It had been said that if Mr. Satterthwaite were found at the houses of those rich who had newly arrived, it was a sign either that the cooking was unusually good, or that a drama of human life was to be enacted there. Mr. Satterthwaite was abnormally interested in the comedies and tragedies of his fellow men. Lady Cynthia, who was a middle-aged woman, with a hard face and a liberal allowance of makeup, tapped him smartly with the newest thing in parasols which lay rakishly across her knee. "Don't pretend you don't understand me. You do perfectly. What's more, I believe you're here on purpose to see the fur fly." Mr. Satterthwaite protested vigorously. He didn't know what she was talking about. "I'm talking about Richard Scott. Do you pretend you've never heard of him?" "No, of course not. He's the big game man, isn't he? That's it, great big bears and tigers, etc., as the song says. Of course, he's a great lion himself. Just now the uncurtains would naturally be mad to get hold of him and the bride. A charming child, oh. Quite a charming child, but so naive, only 20, you know, and he must be at least 45. Mrs. Scott seems to be very charming," said Mr. Satterthwaite sedately. "Yes, poor child." "Why poor child?" Lady Cynthia cast him a look of reproach, and went on approaching the point at issue in her own manner. "Porter's all right, a dull dog, though, another of these African hunters, all sunburnt and silent. Second fiddle to Richard Scott, and always has been lifelong friends and all that sort of thing. When I come to think of it, I believe they were together on that trip." "Which trip?" "The trip. The Mrs. Staverton trip. You'll be saying next you've never heard of Mrs. Staverton." "I have heard of Mrs. Staverton," said Mr. Satterthwaite, almost with unwillingness. And he and Lady Cynthia exchanged glances. "It's so exactly like the uncurtains," wailed the latter. "They are absolutely hopeless socially, I mean. The idea of asking those two together. Of course they'd heard that Mrs. Staverton was a sportswoman and a traveler and all that, and about her book. People like the uncurtains don't even begin to realize what pitfalls there are. I've been running them, myself, for the last year, and what I've gone through nobody knows. One has to be constantly at their elbow. Don't do that. You can't do this. Thank goodness, I'm through with it now. Not that we've quarreled, oh. No, I never quarrel, but somebody else can take on the job. As I've always said, I can put up with vulgarity, but I can't stand meanness." After this somewhat cryptic utterance, Lady Cynthia was silent for a moment, ruminating on the uncurtains' meanness as displayed to herself. "If I'd still been running the show for them," she went on presently, "I should have said quite firmly and plainly, you can't ask Mrs. Staverton with the Richard Scotts. She and he were once dash." She stopped eloquently. "But were they once?" asked Mr. Satterthwaite. "My dear man. It's well known. That trip into the interior. I'm surprised the woman had the face to accept the invitation." "Perhaps she didn't know the others were coming," suggested Mr. Satterthwaite. "Perhaps she did. That's far more likely." "You think?" "She's what I call a dangerous woman, the sort of woman who'd stick at nothing. I wouldn't be in Richard Scott's shoes this weekend. And his wife knows nothing, you think?" "I'm certain of it. But I suppose some kind friend will enlighten her sooner or later. Here's Jimmy Allinson. Such a nice boy. He saved my life in Egypt last winter. I was so bored, you know. Hello, Jimmy, come here at once." Captain Allinson obeyed, dropping down on the turf beside her. He was a handsome young fellow of 30, with white teeth and an infectious smile. "I'm glad somebody wants me," he observed. "The Scots are doing the turtle-dove stunt, 2 required, not 3, Porter's devouring the field, and I've been in mortal danger of being entertained by my hostess." He laughed. Lady Cynthia laughed with him. Mr. Satterthwaite, who was in some ways a little old-fashioned, so much so that he seldom made fun of his host and hostess until after he had left their house, remained grave. "Poor Jimmy," said Lady Cynthia, "mine not to reason why, mine but to swiftly fly. I had a barrow escape of being told the family ghost story." "An uncurtained ghost," said Lady Cynthia. "Ow, screaming." "Not an uncurtained ghost," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "A Greenways ghost. They bought it with the house." "Of course," said Lady Cynthia. "I remember now. But it doesn't clank chains, does it?" It's only something to do with a window. Jimmy Allinson looked up quickly. A window? But for the moment Mr. Satterthwaite did not answer. He was looking over Jimmy's head at three figures approaching from the direction of the house, a slim girl between two men. There was a superficial resemblance between the men, both were tall and dark with bronzed faces and quick eyes, but looked at more closely the resemblance vanished. Richard Scott, hunter and explorer, was a man of extraordinarily vivid personality. He had a manner that radiated magnetism. John Porter, his friend and fellow hunter, was a man of squarer build with an impassive, rather wooden face, and very thoughtful grey eyes. He was a quiet man, content always to play second fiddle to his friend. And between these two walked Moira Scott who, until 3 months ago, had been Moira O'Connell. A slender figure, big wistful brown eyes, and golden red hair that stood out round her small face like a saint's halo. "That child mustn't be hurt," said Mr. Satterthwaite to himself. It would be abominable that a child like that should be hurt. Lady Cynthia greeted the newcomers with a wave of the latest thing in parasols. "Sit down, and don't interrupt," she said. "Mr. Satterthwaite is telling us a ghost story." "I love ghost stories," said Moira Scott. She dropped down on the grass. "The ghost of Greenway's house?" asked Richard Scott. "Yes. You know about it?" Scott nodded. "I used to stay here in the old days," he explained. "Before the Elliots had to sell up. The Watching Cavalier, that's it, isn't it?" "The Watching Cavalier," said his wife softly. "I like that. It sounds interesting. Please go on." But Mr. Satterthwaite seemed somewhat loath to do so. He assured her that it was not really interesting at all. "Now you've done it, Satterthwaite," said Richard Scott sardonically. "That hint of reluctance clinches it." In response to popular clamor, Mr. Satterthwaite was forced to speak. "It's really very uninteresting," he said apologetically. "I believe the original story centers round a Cavalier ancestor of the Elliot family. His wife had a Roundhead lover. The husband was killed by the lover in an upstairs room, and the guilty pair fled, but as they fled, they looked back at the house, and saw the face of the dead husband at the window, watching them. That is the legend, but the ghost story is only concerned with a pane of glass in the window of that particular room on which is an irregular stain, almost imperceptible from near at hand, but which from far away certainly gives the effect of a man's face looking out." "Which window is it?" asked Mrs. Scott, looking up at the house. "You can't see it from here," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "It is round the other side but was boarded up from the inside some years ago, 40 years ago, I think, to be accurate." "What did they do that for?" "I thought you said the ghost didn't walk." "It doesn't," Mr. Satterthwaite assured her. I suppose there grew to be a superstitious feeling about it, that's all." Then, deftly enough, he succeeded in turning the conversation. Jimmy Allinson was perfectly ready to hold forth upon Egyptian sand diviners. Frauds, most of them. Ready enough to tell you vague things about the past, but won't commit themselves as to the future. "I should have thought it was usually the other way about," remarked John Porter. "It's illegal to tell the future in this country, isn't it?" said Richard Scott. Moira persuaded a gypsy into telling her fortune, but the woman gave her shilling back, and said there was nothing doing, or words to that effect. "Perhaps she saw something so frightful that she didn't like to tell it me," said Moira. "Don't pile on the agony, Mrs. Scott," said Allinson lightly. "I, for one, refuse to believe that an unlucky fate is hanging over you." "I wonder," thought Mr. Satterthwaite to himself. "I wonder." Then he looked up sharply. 2 women were coming from the house, a short stout woman with black hair, inappropriately dressed in jade green, and a tall slim figure in creamy white. The first woman was his hostess, Mrs. Uncurtain, the second was a woman he had often heard of, but never met. "Here's Mrs. Staverton," announced Mrs. Uncurtain, in a tone of great satisfaction. "All friends here, I think. These people have an uncanny gift for saying just the most awful things they can," murmured Lady Cynthia, but Mr. Satterthwaite was not listening. He was watching Mrs. Staverton. Very easy, very natural, her careless hello. "Richard, ages since we met. Sorry I couldn't come to the wedding. Is this your wife?" You must be tired of meeting all your husband's weather-beaten old friends. Moira's response suitable, rather shy. The elder woman's swift appraising glance that went on lightly to another old friend. Hello, John. The same easy tone, but with a subtle difference in it, a warming quality that had been absent before. And then that sudden smile. It transformed her. Lady Cynthia had been quite right. A dangerous woman. Very fair, deep blue eyes, not the traditional coloring of the siren, a face almost haggard in repose. A woman with a slow dragging voice and a sudden dazzling smile. Iris Staverton sat down. She became naturally and inevitably the center of the group. So you felt it would always be. Mr. Satterthwaite was recalled from his thoughts by Major Porter suggesting a stroll. Mr. Satterthwaite, who was not as a general rule much given to strolling, acquiesced. The two men sauntered off together across the lawn. Very interesting story of yours just now, said the Major. I will show you the window, said Mr. Satterthwaite. He led the way round to the west side of the house. Here there was a small formal garden, the Privy Garden, it was always called, and there was some point in the name, for it was surrounded by high holly hedges, and even the entrance to it ran zigzag between the same high prickly hedges. Once inside, it was very charming, with an old-world charm of formal flower beds, flagged paths and a low stone seat, exquisitely carved. When they had reached the center of the garden, Mr. Satterthwaite turned and pointed up at the house. The length of Greenway's house ran north and south. In this narrow west wall there was only one window, a window on the first floor, almost overgrown by ivy, with grimy panes, and which you could just see was boarded up on the inside. There you are, said Mr. Satterthwaite. Craning his neck a little, Porter looked up. I can see a kind of discoloration on one of the panes, nothing more. We're too near, said Mr. Satterthwaite. There's a clearing higher up in the woods where you get a really good view. He led the way out of the Privy Garden, and turning sharply to the left, struck into the woods. A certain enthusiasm of showmanship possessed him, and he hardly noticed that the man at his side was absent and inattentive. They had, of course, to make another window, when they boarded up this one, he explained. The new one faces south, overlooking the lawn where we were sitting just now. I rather fancy the Scores have the room in question. That is why I didn't want to pursue the subject. Mrs. Scott might have felt nervous if she had realized that she was sleeping in what might be called the haunted room. Yes. I see, said Porter. Mr. Satterthwaite looked at him sharply, and realized that the other had not heard a word of what he was saying. Very interesting, said Porter. He slashed with his stick at some tall foxgloves, and, frowning, he said, "She ought not to have come. She ought never to have come." People often spoke after this fashion to Mr. Satterthwaite. He seemed to matter so little, to have so negative a personality. He was merely a glorified listener. "No," said Porter, "she ought never to have come." Mr. Satterthwaite knew instinctively that it was not of Mrs. Scott he spoke. "You think not?" he asked. Porter shook his head as though in foreboding. "I was on that trip," he said abruptly. "The three of us went. Scott and I and Iris. She's a wonderful woman and a damned fine shot." He paused. "What made them ask her?" he finished abruptly. Mr. Satterthwaite shrugged his shoulders. "Ignorance," he said. "There's going to be trouble," said the other. "We must stand by and do what we can." "But surely Mrs. Staverton—" "I'm talking of Scott." He paused. "You see, there's Mrs. Scott to consider." Mr. Satterthwaite had been considering her all along, but he did not think it necessary to say so, since the other man had so clearly forgotten her until this minute. "How did Scott meet his wife?" he asked. "Last winter, in Cairo. A quick business. They were engaged in 3 weeks, and married in 6. She seems to me very charming." "She is, no doubt about it. And he adores her, but that will make no difference." And again Major Porter repeated to himself, "You." Sing the pronoun that meant to him one person only. Hang it all, she shouldn't have come. Just then they stepped out upon a high grassy knoll at some little distance from the house. With again something of the pride of the showman, Mr. Satterthwaite stretched out his arm. "Look," he said. It was fast growing dusk. The window could still be plainly descried, and apparently pressed against one of the panes was a man's face surmounted by a plumed cavalier's hat. "Very curious," said Porter. "Really very curious. What will happen when that pane of glass gets smashed some day?" Mr. Satterthwaite smiled. "That is one of the most interesting parts of the story. That pane of glass has been replaced to my certain knowledge at least 11 times, perhaps oftener. The last time was 12 years ago when the then owner of the house determined to destroy the myth. But it's always the same. The stain reappears not all at once, the discoloration spreads gradually. It takes a month or 2 as a rule." For the first time, Porter showed signs of real interest. He gave a sudden quick shiver. "Damned odd, these things. No accounting for them. What's the real reason of having the room boarded up inside?" "Well, an idea got about that the room was unlucky. The Eveshams were in it just before the divorce. Then Stanley and his wife were staying here, and had that room when he ran off with his chorus girl." Porter raised his eyebrows. "I see. Danger, not to life, but to morals. And now," thought Mr. Satterthwaite to himself, "the Scots have it. I wonder." They retraced their steps in silence to the house. Walking almost noiselessly on the soft turf, each absorbed in his own thoughts, they became unwittingly eavesdroppers. They were rounding the corner of the holly hedge when they heard Iris Staverton's voice raised fierce and clear from the depths of the privy garden. "You shall be sorry for this." Scott's voice answered low and uncertain, so that the words could not be distinguished, and then the woman's voice rose again, speaking words that they were to remember later. "Jealousy, it drives one to the devil, it is the devil. It can drive one to black murder. Be careful, Richard, for God's sake, be careful." And then on that she had come out of the privy garden ahead of them, and on round the corner of the house without seeing them, walking swiftly, almost running, like a woman hag-ridden and pursued. Mr. Satterthwaite thought again of Lady Cynthia's words. A dangerous woman. For the first time, he had a premonition of tragedy, coming swift and inexorable, not to be gainsaid. Yet that evening he felt ashamed of his fears. Everything seemed normal and pleasant. Mrs. Staverton, with her easy insouciance, showed no sign of strain. Moira Scott was her charming, unaffected self. The 2 women appeared to be getting on very well. Richard Scott himself seemed to be in boisterous spirits. The most worried-looking person was stout Mrs. Uncurtain. She confided at length in Mr. Satterthwaite. "Think it's silly or not, as you like, there's something giving me the creeps. And I'll tell you frankly, I've sent for the glazier unbeknown to Ned, the glazier, to put a new pane of glass in that window. It's all very well. Ned's proud of it, says it gives the house a tone. I don't like it. I tell you flat. We'll have a nice plain modern pane of glass, with no nasty stories attached to it. You forget, said Mr. Satterthwaite, or perhaps you don't know. The stain comes back. That's as it may be, said Mrs. Uncurtain. All I can say is if it does, it's against nature. Mr. Satterthwaite raised his eyebrows, but did not reply. And what if it does, pursued Mrs. Uncurtain defiantly. We're not so bankrupt, Ned and I, that we can't afford a new pane of glass every month or every week if need be for the matter of that. Mr. Satterthwaite did not meet the challenge. He had seen too many things crumple and fall before the power of money to believe that even a cavalier ghost could put up a successful fight. Nevertheless, he was interested by Mrs. Uncurtain's manifest uneasiness. Even she was not exempt from the tension in the atmosphere, only she attributed it to an attenuated ghost story, not to the clash of personalities amongst her guests. Mr. Satterthwaite was fated to hear yet another scrap of conversation which threw light upon the situation. He was going up the wide staircase to bed. John Porter and Mrs. Staverton were sitting together in an alcove of the big hall. She was speaking with a faint irritation in her golden voice. I hadn't the least idea the Scotts were going to be here. I dare say, if I had known, I shouldn't have come, but I can assure you, my dear John, that now I am here, I'm not going to run away. Mr. Satterthwaite passed on up the staircase out of earshot. He thought to himself, I wonder now how much of that is true. Did she know? I wonder what's going to come of it. He shook his head. In the clear light of the morning he felt that he had perhaps been a little melodramatic in his imaginings of the evening before. A moment of strain, yes, certainly inevitable under the circumstances, but nothing more. People adjusted themselves. His fancy that some great catastrophe was pending was nerves, pure nerves, or possibly liver. Yes, that was it, liver. He was due at Carlsbad in another fortnight. On his own account he proposed a little stroll that evening just as it was growing dusk. He suggested to Major Porter that they should go up to the clearing and see if Mrs. Uncurtain had been as good as her word, and had a new pane of glass put in. To himself, he said, exercise, that's what I need. Exercise. The two men walked slowly through the woods. Porter, as usual, was taciturn. I can't help feeling, said Mr. Satterthwaite loquaciously, that we were a little foolish in our imaginings yesterday. Expecting trouble, you know. After all, people have to behave themselves, swallow their feelings and that sort of thing. Perhaps, said Porter. After a minute or two he added, civilized people. You mean? People who've lived outside civilization a good deal sometimes go back. Revert. Whatever you call it. They emerged onto the grassy knoll. Mr. Satterthwaite was breathing rather fast. He never enjoyed going uphill. He looked towards the window. The face was still there, more lifelike than ever. Our hostess has repented, I see. Porter threw it only a cursory glance. Uncurtain cut up rough, I expect, he said indifferently. He's the sort of man who is willing to be proud of another family's ghost, and who isn't going to run the risk of having it driven away when he's paid spot cash for it. He was silent a minute or two, staring, not at the house, but at the thick undergrowth by which they were surrounded. Has it ever struck you, he said, that civilization's damned dangerous? Dangerous? Such a revolutionary remark shocked Mr. Satterthwaite to the core. Yes. There are no safety valves, you see. He turned abruptly, and they descended the path by which they had come. I really am quite at a loss to understand you, said Mr. Satterthwaite, pattering along with nimble steps to keep up with the other's strides. Reasonable people, Porter laughed. A short disconcerting laugh. Then he looked at the correct little gentleman by his side. You think it's all bunkum on my part, Mr. Satterthwaite? But there are people, you know, who can tell you when a storm's coming. They feel it beforehand in the air. And other people can foretell trouble. There's trouble coming now, Mr. Satterthwaite, big trouble. It may come any minute. It may. He stopped dead, clutching Mr. Satterthwaite's arm. And in that tense minute of silence it came with the sound of two shots and following them a cry in a woman's voice. My God, cried Porter, it's come. He raced down the path, Mr. Satterthwaite panting behind him. In a minute they came out onto the lawn, close by the hedge of the privy garden. At the same time, Richard Scott and Mr. Uncurtain came round the opposite corner of the house. They halted, facing each other, to left and right of the entrance to the privy garden. It came from in there," said Uncurtain, pointing with a flabby hand. "We must see," said Porter. He led the way into the enclosure. As he rounded the last bend of the holly hedge, he stopped dead. Mr. Satterthwaite peered over his shoulder. A loud cry burst from Richard Scott. There were 3 people in the privy garden. 2 of them lay on the grass near the stone seat, a man and a woman. The third was Mrs. Staverton. She was standing quite close to them by the holly hedge, gazing with horror-stricken eyes, and holding something in her right hand. "Iris," cried Porter. "Iris. For God's sake. What's that you've got in your hand?" She looked down at it then with a kind of wonder, an unbelievable indifference. "It's a pistol," she said wonderingly. And then, after what seemed an interminable time, but was in reality only a few seconds, "I've picked it up." Mr. Satterthwaite had gone forward to where Uncurtain and Scott were kneeling on the turf. "A doctor," the latter was murmuring. "We must have a doctor." But it was too late for any doctor. Jimmy Allinson, who had complained that the sand diviners hedged about the future, and Moira Scott, to whom the gypsy had returned a shilling, lay there in the last great stillness. It was Richard Scott who completed a brief examination. The iron nerve of the man showed in this crisis. After the first cry of agony, he was himself again. He laid his wife gently down again. "Shot from behind," he said briefly. "The bullet has passed right through her." Then he handled Jimmy Allinson. The wound here was in the breast and the bullet was lodged in the body. John Porter came towards them. "Nothing should be touched," he said sternly. "The police must see it all exactly as it is now." "The police," said Richard Scott. His eyes lit up with a sudden flame as he looked at the woman standing by the holly hedge. He made a step in that direction, but at the same time John Porter also moved, so as to bar his way. For a moment it seemed as though there was a duel of eyes between the 2 friends. Porter very quietly shook his head. "No, Richard," he said. "It looks like it, but you're wrong." Richard Scott spoke with difficulty, moistening his dry lips. "Then why has she got that in her hand?" And again Iris Staverton said in the same lifeless tone, "I've picked it up." "The police," said Uncurtain, rising. "We must send for the police at once." "You will telephone perhaps, Scott?" "Someone should stay here." "Yes, I am sure someone should stay here." In his quiet gentlemanly manner, Mr. Satterthwaite offered to do so. His host accepted the offer with manifest relief. "The ladies," he explained. "I must break the news to the ladies, Lady Cynthia and my dear wife." Mr. Satterthwaite stayed in the privy garden looking down on the body of that which had once been Moira Scott. "Poor child," he said to himself. "Poor child." He quoted to himself the tag about the evil men do living after them. For was not Richard Scott in a way responsible for his innocent wife's death? They would hang Iris Staverton, he supposed, not that he liked to think of it, but was not it at least a part of the blame he laid at the man's door? The evil that men do, and the girl, the innocent girl, had paid. He looked down at her with a very deep pity. Her small face, so white and wistful, a half-smile on the lips still. The ruffled golden hair, the delicate ear. There was a spot of blood on the lobe of it. With an inner feeling of being something of a detective, Mr. Satterthwaite deduced an earring, torn away in her fall. He craned his neck forward. Yes, he was right, there was a small pearl drop hanging from the other ear. Poor child, and now, sir," said Inspector Winkfield. They were in the library. The inspector, a shrewd-looking forceful man of 40-odd, was concluding his investigations. He had questioned most of the guests, and had by now pretty well made up his mind on the case. He was listening to what Major Porter and Mr. Satterthwaite had to say. Mr. Uncurtain sat heavily in a chair, staring with protruding eyes at the opposite wall. "As I understand it, gentlemen," said the inspector, "you'd been for a walk. You were returning to the house by a path that winds round the left side of what they call the privy garden. Is that correct?" "Quite correct, Inspector." "You heard 2 shots, and a woman's scream?" "Yes." "You then ran as fast as you could, emerged from the woods and made your way to the entrance of the privy garden?" If anybody had left that garden, they could only do so by one entrance. The holly bushes are impassable. If anyone had run out of the garden and turned to the right, he would have been met by Mr. Uncurtain and Mr. Scott. If he had turned to the left, he could not have done so without being seen by you. Is that right? That is so, said Major Porter. His face was very white. That seems to settle it, said the inspector. Mr. and Mrs. Uncurtain and Lady Cynthia Drage were sitting on the lawn. Mr. Scott was in the billiard room which opens on to that lawn. At 6:10, Mrs. Staverton came out of the house, spoke a word or two to those sitting there, and went round the corner of the house towards the privy garden. 2 minutes later the shots were heard. Mr. Scott rushed out of the house and together with Mr. Uncurtain ran to the privy garden. At the same time you and Mr. Satterthwaite arrived from the opposite direction. Mrs. Staverton was in the privy garden with a pistol in her hand from which 2 shots had been fired. As I see it, she shot the lady first from behind as she was sitting on the bench. Then Captain Allinson sprang up and went for her, and she shot him in the chest as he came towards her. I understand that there had been a previous attachment between her and Mr. Richard Scott. That's a damned lie, said Porter. His voice rang out hoarse and defiant. The inspector said nothing, merely shook his head. What is her own story? Asked Mr. Satterthwaite. She says that she went into the privy garden to be quiet for a little. Just before she rounded the last hedge, she heard the shots. She came round the corner, saw the pistol lying at her feet, and picked it up. No one passed her, and she saw no one in the garden but the 2 victims. The inspector gave an eloquent pause. That's what she says, and although I cautioned her, she insisted on making a statement. If she said that, said Major Porter, and his face was still deadly white, she was speaking the truth. I know Iris Staverton. Well, sir, said the inspector, there'll be plenty of time to go into all that later. In the meantime, I've got my duty to do. With an abrupt movement, Porter turned to Mr. Satterthwaite. You. Can't you help? Can't you do something? Mr. Satterthwaite could not help feeling immensely flattered. He had been appealed to, be most insignificant of men, and by a man like John Porter. He was just about to flutter out a regretful reply, when the butler, Thompson, entered, with a card upon a salver which he took to his master with an apologetic cough. Mr. Uncurtain was still sitting huddled up in a chair, taking no part in the proceedings. I told the gentleman you would probably not be able to see him, sir, said Thompson. But he insisted that he had an appointment and that it was most urgent. Uncurtain took the card. Mr. Harley Quinn, he read. I remember, he was to see me about a picture. I did make an appointment, but as things are, but Mr. Satterthwaite had started forward. Mr. Harley Quinn, did you say? He cried. How extraordinary, how very extraordinary. Major Porter, you asked me if I could help you. I think I can. This Mr. Quinn is a friend, or I should say, an acquaintance of mine. He is a most remarkable man. One of these amateur solvers of crime, I suppose, remarked the inspector disparagingly. No, said Mr. Satterthwaite, he is not that kind of man at all. But he has a power, an almost uncanny power of showing you what you have seen with your own eyes, of making clear to you what you have heard with your own ears. Let us, at any rate, give him an outline of the case, and hear what he has to say. Mr. Uncurtain glanced at the inspector, who merely snorted and looked at the ceiling. Then the former gave a short nod to Thompson, who left the room and returned ushering in a tall, slim stranger. Mr. Uncurtain. The stranger shook him by the hand. I am sorry to intrude upon you at such a time. We must leave our little picture chat until another time. Ah. My friend Mr. Satterthwaite. Still as fond of the drama as ever. A faint smile played for a minute round the stranger's lips as he said these last words. Mr. Quinn, said Mr. Satterthwaite impressively, we have a drama here, we are in the midst of one, I should like, and my friend, Major Porter, would like, to have your opinion of it. Mr. Quinn sat down. The red-shaded lamp threw a broad band of colored light over the checked pattern of his overcoat, and left his face in shadow almost as though he wore a mask. Succinctly, Mr. Satterthwaite recited the main points of the tragedy. Then he paused, breathlessly awaiting the words of the oracle. But Mr. Quinn merely shook his head. A sad story, he said. A very sad and shocking tragedy. The lack of motive makes it very intriguing. Uncurtain stared at him. You don't understand, he said. Mrs. Staverton was heard to threaten Richard Scott. She was bitterly jealous of his wife. Jealousy, I agree, said Mr. Quinn. Jealousy or demoniac possession. It's all the same. But you misunderstand me. I was not referring to the murder of Mrs. Scott, but to that of Captain Allinson. You're right, cried Porter, springing forward. There's a flaw there. If Iris had ever contemplated shooting Mrs. Scott, she'd have got her alone somewhere. No, we're on the wrong tack. And I think I see another solution. Only those 3 people went into the Privy Garden. That is indisputable and I don't intend to dispute it. But I reconstruct the tragedy differently. Supposing Jimmy Allinson shoots first Mrs. Scott and then himself. That's possible, isn't it? He flings the pistol from him as he falls. Mrs. Staverton finds it lying on the ground and picks it up just as she said. How's that? The inspector shook his head. Won't wash, Major Porter. If Captain Allinson had fired that shot close to his body, the cloth would have been singed. He might have held the pistol at arm's length. Why should he? No sense in it. Besides, there's no motive. Might have gone off his head suddenly, muttered Porter, but without any great conviction. He fell to silence again, suddenly rousing himself to say defiantly, well, Mr. Quinn. The latter shook his head. I'm not a magician. I'm not even a criminologist. But I will tell you one thing, I believe in the value of impressions. In any time of crisis, there is always one moment that stands out from all the others, one picture that remains when all else has faded. Mr. Satterthwaite is, I think, likely to have been the most unprejudiced observer of those present. Will you cast your mind back, Mr. Satterthwaite, and tell us the moment that made the strongest impression on you? Was it when you heard the shots? Was it when you first saw the dead bodies? Was it when you first observed the pistol in Mrs. Staverton's hand? Clear your mind of any preconceived standard of values, and tell us. Mr. Satterthwaite fixed his eyes on Mr. Quinn's face, rather as a schoolboy might repeat a lesson of which he was not sure. No, he said slowly. It was not any of those. The moment that I shall always remember was when I stood alone by the bodies, afterwards looking down on Mrs. Scott. She was lying on her side. Her hair was ruffled. There was a spot of blood on her little ear. And instantly, as he said it, he felt that he had said a terrific, a significant thing. Blood on her ear. Yes, I remember, said Uncurtain slowly. Her earring must have been torn out when she fell, explained Mr. Satterthwaite. But it sounded a little improbable as he said it. She was lying on her left side, said Porter. I suppose it was that ear. No, said Mr. Satterthwaite quickly. It was her right ear. The inspector coughed. I found this in the grass, he vouchsafed. He held up a loop of gold wire. But, my God, man, cried Porter. The thing can't have been wrenched to pieces by a mere fall. It's more as though it had been shot away by a bullet. So it was, cried Mr. Satterthwaite. It was a bullet. It must have been. There were only 2 shots, said the inspector. A shot can't have grazed her ear and shot her in the back as well. And if one shot carried away the earring, and the second shot killed her, it can't have killed Captain Allinson as well, and not unless he was standing close in front of her, very close, facing her as it might be. Oh, I know, not even then, unless, that is, unless she was in his arms, you were going to say, said Mr. Quinn, with a queer little smile. Well, why not? Everyone stared at each other. The idea was so vitally strange to them. Allinson and Mrs. Scott, Mr. Uncurtain voiced the same feeling. But they hardly knew each other, he said. I don't know, said Mr. Satterthwaite thoughtfully. They might have known each other better than we thought. Lady Cynthia said he saved her from being bored in Egypt last winter, and you, he turned to Porter, you told me that Richard Scott met his wife in C. Aero last winter. They might have known each other very well indeed out there. They didn't seem to be together much, said Uncurtain. No, they rather avoided each other. It was almost unnatural, now I come to think of it. They all looked at Mr. Quinn, as if a little startled at the conclusions at which they had arrived so unexpectedly. Mr. Quinn rose to his feet. You see, he said, what Mr. Satterthwaite's impression has done for us. He turned to Uncurtain. It is your turn now. I don't understand you. You were very thoughtful when I came into this room. I should like to know exactly what thought it was that obsessed you. Never mind if it has nothing to do with the tragedy. Never mind if it seems to you superstitious. Mr. Uncurtain started, ever so slightly. Tell us. I don't mind telling you, said Uncurtain. Though it's nothing to do with the business, and you'll probably laugh at me into the bargain. I was wishing that my missus had left well alone and not replaced that pane of glass in the haunted window. I feel as though doing that has maybe brought a curse upon us. He was unable to understand why the 2 men opposite him stared so. But she hasn't replaced it yet, said Mr. Satterthwaite at last. Yes, she has. Man came first thing this morning. My God, said Porter, I begin to understand. That room, it's panelled, I supposed, not papered. Yes, but what does that? But Porter had swung out of the room. The other followed him. He went straight upstairs to the Scots' bedroom. It was a charming room, panelled in cream with 2 windows facing south. Porter felt with his hands along the panels on the western wall. There's a spring somewhere, must be. Ah! There was a click, and a section of the paneling rolled back. It disclosed the grimy panes of the haunted window. One pane of glass was clean and new. Porter stooped quickly and picked up something. He held it out on the palm of his hand. It was a fragment of ostrich feather. Then he looked at Mr. Quinn. Mr. Quinn nodded. He went across to the hat cupboard in the bedroom. There were several hats in it, the dead woman's hats. He took out one with a large brim and curling feathers, an elaborate ascot hat. Mr. Quinn began speaking in a gentle, reflective voice. Let us suppose, said Mr. Quinn, a man who is by nature intensely jealous. A man who has stayed here in bygone years and knows the secret of the spring in the paneling. To amuse himself he opens it one day, and looks out over the privy garden. There, secure as they think from being overlooked, he sees his wife and another man. There can be no possible doubt in his mind as to the relations between them. He is mad with rage. What shall he do? An idea comes to him. He goes to the cupboard and puts on the hat with the brim and feathers. It is growing dusk, and he remembers the story of the stain on the glass. Anyone looking up at the window will see as they think the watching cavalier. Thus secure he watches them, and at the moment they are clasped in each other's arms, he shoots. He is a good shot, a wonderful shot. As they fall, he fires once more. That shot carries away the earring. He flings the pistol out of the window into the privy garden, rushes downstairs, and out through the billiard room. Porter took a step towards him. But he let her be accused, he cried. He stood by and let her be accused. Why? Why? I think I know why, said Mr. Quinn. I should guess it's only guesswork on my part. Mind that Richard Scott was once madly in love with Iris Staverton, so madly that even meeting her years afterward stirred up the embers of jealousy again. I should say that Iris Staverton once fancied that she might love him, that she went on a hunting trip with him and another, and that she came back in love with the better man. The better man, muttered Porter, dazed. You mean? Yes, said Mr. Quinn, with a faint smile. I mean you. He paused a minute, and then said, if I were you I should go to her now. I will, said Porter. He turned and left the room.